a man, drowning in debt and regret, inherited a crumbling monument to failure. Everyone thought it was a curse, a final cruel joke from the past. But when his son's curiosity broke through a forgotten wall, they uncovered a secret everyone thought was a myth. What they found didn't just change their fortune. It redeemed a forgotten dream. Before we witness a discovery that rewrites a family's destiny, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories of hidden legacies and incredible turns of fate straight to you. The rain fell on Ravenswood not as a gentle shower, but as a gray, relentless curtain. It matched the mood of Arthur Pellington as he stood on the cracked sidewalk, staring up at the monstrosity he'd inherited. The Ravenswood Museum of Natural and Local History wasn't a building. It was a tombstone. Its grand Victorian facade, once proud, was now a patchwork of peeling white paint and rotten wood. The glass in the arched windows was murky, some panes cracked or boarded over. It smelled of damp plaster, forgotten things, and a fortune in mold remediation. Arthur, a man of 55 with the weary shoulders of a lifelong librarian, felt the weight of it all. The letter from the lawyer was crumpled in his jacket pocket. His great-uncle, Alastair Pellington, the town's eccentric dreamer, had left him everything. Everything being a cavernous, leaking building, a mountain of back taxes, and the ghost of a dream that had bankrupted 2 generations of Pellingtons. Home, sweet home. A voice said beside him, laced with sarcasm only a 17-year-old could muster. Leo, Arthur's son, shoved his hands into the pockets of his hoodie. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the building not with despair, but with a flicker of intrigue. Where Arthur saw a burden, Leo saw a mystery. It's not a home, Leo. It's an albatross. Arthur sighed, fumbling with a heavy, rusted key. The lawyer said the auction for the contents is next month. Maybe we can sell the stained glass windows, some of the older display cases, pay off a fraction of the debt. The lock finally gave a groan. The door swung inward, revealing a vast, dark hall. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, cutting through the grime. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor, a sound that seemed to travel for miles. The air was thick and still. The museum was a time capsule failure. There were displays of local geology, boring lumps of rock labeled in fading ink, a taxidermied bobcat, moth-eaten and leering, forever pouncing on a threadbare squirrel, cases filled with arrowheads and pottery shards. In the center of the main hall stood the crown jewel of Alastair's Folly, a full-scale replica of a gray whale skeleton, suspended from the ceiling by wires that looked dangerously frail. Plastered dust snowed gently from its ribs. "This is so bleak," Leo whispered, his voice full of a rather than disgust. He ran a finger along the case, leaving a trail in the dust. "It's like he just locked the door one day and walked away." He practically did, Arthur said, his heart aching. He remembered Uncle Alastair, a man with wild eyes and wilder stories of a masterpiece that would put Ravenswood on the map, a story everyone dismissed as the rambling of a madman. Arthur's phone buzzed. It was another email from a bank. The subject line, "Final Notice," glowed in the dim light. He felt the walls, both figurative and literal, closing in. This inheritance wasn't a fresh start. It was the final nail in his financial coffin. He had 2 weeks before the county seized the property for back taxes. 2 weeks before he and Leo would have nowhere to go. He slumped onto a dusty bench beneath the whale's giant skull, head in his hands. The weight of it was crushing him. He was a practical man, a man of books and quiet order. This chaotic monument to delusion was his antithesis. Leo, however, didn't sit. He explored. He was drawn to a large, detailed map of the museum framed on the wall behind the reception desk. It showed exhibit halls, storage rooms, and offices. But as he looked closer, tracing the lines, he noticed something odd. The dimensions didn't quite add up. According to the map, the wall behind the geology display should have been much thicker than it appeared from the outside. "Dad," Leo called out, his voice cutting through the silence. "Did great-uncle Alastair ever talk about renovations? Sealing off any rooms?" Arthur looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "What? No, Leo, not now. He just talked about his magnum opus. A collection so grand it would make people weep. Never saw it. Of course. Probably just another one of the stories. But Leo wasn't listening. He was already at the geology display, pushing aside a heavy case of quartz samples. He knocked on the wall behind it. It didn't sound like plaster and laugh. It sounded solid, but with a faint, hollow echo behind the solidity. Unlike the other walls, this one was painted a dull, industrial gray, seamless and without trim. "Dad," Leo said, his voice now charged with new energy. "Get over here. I think this wall is lying." The hammer and the whisper. Arthur wanted to ignore him. Every logical bone in his body screamed to call a real estate liquidator, to start cataloging the dust-covered junk for auction. But the desperate hope in his son's voice, a sound he hadn't heard in years, pulled him to his feet. "Leo, it's just a load-bearing wall. Or it's filled with pipes. This place is 100 years old. The blueprint were probably wrong," Arthur said, his practicality a shield against yet another disappointment. "Then why does it sound like this?" Leo insisted. He grabbed a heavy geode from a display and rapped it firmly against the gray surface. Thud, thud. It was a dead, solid sound. But then he moved a foot to the left and struck again. Thunk. The tone was different. Subtly higher, less dense. A spark of curiosity, faint but undeniable, ignited in Arthur's chest. He joined Leo, pressing his ear against the cold wall as his son tapped. He heard it too. A difference. A secret. "It could be nothing," Arthur murmured, but he was already looking around for a tool. His eyes landed on a fire axe, sealed behind glass in a nearby emergency case. With a grimace, he used the heel of his shoe to shatter the thin glass. The screech echoed through the silent hall. The axe felt heavy and wrong in his hands, a tool of destruction, not of discovery. He was a librarian. He preserved knowledge. He didn't break through walls seeking it. He hesitated, the weight of his actions settling on him. This was vandalism. This was the act of a desperate man chasing ghosts. "Do it, Dad," Leo urged, his eyes wide. "What's the worst that could happen? We ruin a wall in a building they're going to tear down anyway." It was the permission he needed. Arthur took a deep breath, raised the axe, and swung. The head bit into the drywall with a sickening crunch, sending a cloud of dust into the air. He swung again and again, each blow a release of weeks of pent-up frustration and fear. He wasn't just breaking a wall. He was attacking the debt, the failure, the ghost of his crazy uncle. Leo coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. Okay, maybe a little less rage, a little more precision." Arthur stopped, panting. He had created a hole about the size of a dinner plate. Beyond it was not insulation or plumbing, but darkness. A cold, dry, ancient-smelling air whispered out from the hole, carrying the scent of old paper, cedar, and time. Leo shoved his phone through the gap, turning on the flashlight. The light didn't reflect off pipes or concrete. It seemed to travel, swallowed by a vast, empty space. What is it?" Arthur asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Leo's face, illuminated by the phone's glow, was a mask of stunned disbelief. "It's a room, Dad. A big one." He pulled his phone back and aimed the camera, taking a picture with a flash. The bright light momentarily illuminated what was inside. He looked at the screen, and his breath hitched. What is it?" Arthur's heart was hammering against his ribs. Wordlessly, Leo handed him the phone. The photo was blurry, starkly lit by the flash. It showed a glimpse of the space beyond. It wasn't a storage closet. It was a gallery. And on the walls, perfectly preserved in custom-built cases, were paintings, dozens of them. But Arthur's eyes weren't drawn to the paintings themselves. They were drawn to the small, familiar signatures in the bottom corners of the frames visible in the flash's glare. Names he recognized from art history books he'd cataloged. Names like O'Keeffe, Hopper, Rockwell. "It can't be," Arthur breathed, his hands beginning to tremble so violently he almost dropped the phone. They're just prints, reproductions. They have to be." Leo's voice was quiet, filled with awe that bordered on terror. "Dad," he said, "who puts reproductions in a sealed, hidden, climate-controlled room?" The axe fell from Arthur's numb fingers and clattered on the marble floor. The sound echoed to the museum, a bell tolling for the end of one life and the terrifying, unbelievable beginning of another, the Ghost Gallery. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was their own ragged breathing and the soft whisper of air from the hidden room. The dust settled around them, a golden haze and the weak light filtering through the hole. Arthur's mind, usually so orderly, was a chaotic whirlwind, climate-controlled. The words echoed. Leo was right. The air from the room wasn't damp or musty. It was dry, stable, and cool. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional preservation. We need to make the hole bigger, Leo said, his earlier caution gone, replaced by a feverish urgency. He grabbed the axe, his younger arms wielding it with energy Arthur couldn't muster. He chipped away at the edges of the hole, enlarging it until it was big enough to crawl through. Arthur found an old extension cord and a work light abandoned in a janitor's closet. With fumbling fingers, he plugged it in, praying the ancient wiring wouldn't electrocute them or burn the place down. The bulb flickered, then cast a stark, unforgiving white light. Leo went first, scrambling through the opening. Arthur heard his sharp intake of breath, followed by a stunned, "Whoa!" Arthur followed, squeezing his larger frame through the gap. He stood up, brushing plaster from his clothes, and the world fell away. They weren't in a room, they were in a vault. The walls were lined with a sleek, modern metal shelving system that looked utterly alien within the century-old building. Soft neutral LED lights, powered by a hidden battery backup system, glowed to life overhead, triggered by their motion. The air hummed with a faint, almost imperceptible sound of a climate control unit, hidden somewhere and still miraculously functioning. And on the shelves, meticulously arranged and protected by glass, was Alastair Pellington's magnum opus. It wasn't a collection of oddities Arthur had expected. It was a focused, breathtaking assembly of 20th century American art. There were bold, vibrant landscapes that could only be Georgia O'Keeffe. There was a hauntingly quiet urban scene, drenched in moonlight, that screamed Edward Hopper. A series of character studies, warm and narrative-driven, bore the unmistakable style of Norman Rockwell. But it was the painting at the far end of the room that stole the air from Arthur's lungs. It was a large canvas, abstract and explosive, a whirlwind of color and energy. He recognized it instantly from an art history seminar he'd taken 30 years ago. It was a Jackson Pollock, a famous one, a painting known to have been lost in a private collection fire in the 1970s. "The stories," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling as he walked forward, his hand hovering over the cool glass of a case containing a small but stunning Andrew Wyeth watercolor. He wasn't crazy. He was a collector, a brilliant secretive collector. Leo was already on his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. "No service in here," he muttered. He took picture after picture, his face pale. "Dad, we need to get online. We need to research. This can't be real. It can't." They scrambled back to the hole into the main hall, their clothes covered in white dust like ghosts. Leo's phone immediately chimed with notifications. He ignored them, pulling up a browser. He searched for Lost Jackson Pollock, and the results loaded. He clicked on images, and there it was, a black and white photograph from a 1950s art magazine. The painting they had just seen. "It's called Convergence Red," Leo read, his voice shaky. "Presumed destroyed in a fire in 1974. He looked up at his father, his eyes wide. "Dad, if that's the real one." Arthur's knees felt weak. He leaned against the taxidermied bobcat for support, not even caring about the moth-eaten fur. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. This wasn't just a few valuable paintings. This was a cultural treasure trove, a collection that could rival a small museum's. And it was his. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. They had a secret, a multi-million-dollar secret hidden in a building that was about to be seized by the county and picked apart by auctioneers. "Leo," Arthur said, his voice low and serious, "you cannot tell anyone about this. Not a soul. Not your friends. No one online. Do you understand me?" Leo nodded, the gravity of the situation finally dawning on him. "What are we going to do?" Arthur looked from the hidden opening back to the main doors of the museum. The world outside with its debts and deadlines, suddenly felt incredibly dangerous. They had found a miracle, but it was a fragile one, surrounded by threats. "We need a plan," Arthur said, his librarian's mind kicking into gear, seeking order in the chaos. "And we need to put that wall back together before anyone knows it was ever broken." A web of doubt and debt. The next 48 hours were a tense, silent ballet of paranoia and preservation. They found rolls of heavy-duty plastic sheeting and a staple gun in a maintenance closet. Working with a frantic energy, they covered the hole in the wall, stapling the plastic tight, and then pushing the heavy geology display case back in front of it. To any casual observer, it looked untouched. But every creak of the old building made them jump. Every car that slowed on the street outside sent a jolt of fear through them. The museum had transformed from a tomb of failure into a vault of unimaginable value, and they were its terrified, unworthy guardians. Arthur spent hours in the main hall with his laptop, using the weak Wi-Fi signal to research. He wasn't looking up the art. He was looking up the law. Inheritance laws, found property, taxation on discovered assets. The more he read, the more complicated it became. If the collection was part of the estate, it might be subject to the same massive inheritance taxes and creditors' claims that were threatening the building itself. They could lose it before they even truly had it. Leo, meanwhile, became a nocturnal creature. He'd wait until deep night, then slip through the plastic sheeting into the hidden gallery with his phone, now equipped with a portable battery pack. He'd take hundreds of high-resolution photos of every painting, every signature, every tiny detail on the frames and the backs of the canvases where possible. He compiled databases, cross-referencing the works with online archives of lost art. His findings were staggering. The Pollock was just the beginning. There was an O'Keeffe flower painting that had vanished from public view in the 1960s, a Hopper sketchbook, filled with study for his most famous works, a Rockwell Saturday Evening Post cover original that was believed to be in a private European collection. The estimated values he found in old auction records made him dizzy. $5 million, $10 million, $20 million. The numbers were abstract, meaningless in their enormity. He'd add them up in a spreadsheet, the total climbing to a figure so large it seemed like a fantasy. Over $75 million. But doubt was a persistent weed in his mind. "Dad," he said one morning, his face drawn from lack of sleep. "What if they're fakes? Really, really good fakes?" Uncle Alistair was broke. How could he afford all this? It was a question that had been gnawing at Arthur, too. The romantic story of the eccentric collector was starting to fray at the edges, replaced by a more unsettling possibility. Maybe that's why he was broke, Arthur reasoned, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Maybe he spent every last dime acquiring these, believing they were real. Maybe he was the greatest art patsy of all time. The thought was devastating. To have hope dangled so tantalizingly close, only to have it be a sophisticated sham. Was a cruelty worse than never finding the room at all? Their internal fears were soon matched by an external threat. A sleek, black sedan pulled up outside the museum. A woman in a sharp, expensive business suit got out. She carried a leather-bound tablet and looked utterly out of place on the derelict street. This was Ms. Sterling, the representative from the bank, holding the museum's debt. Arthur's heart plummeted. He met her at the door, trying to block her view inside. "Mr. Pellington," she said, her smile as cold and polished as her shoes. "Just a courtesy visit. We've received the court order to proceed with the seizure of the property. The assessors will be here on Monday to begin the official inventory for the public auction." Monday? That was 3 days away. I'm working on a solution," Arthur stammered, his mind racing. "I might have a buyer for the property. A private buyer." Ms. Sterling's eyebrow arched skeptically. She peered past him into the dusty, decaying hall. "I wish you the best of luck with that, Mr. Pellington. Truly, but I must be frank. The only thing of value here is the land. The contents," she waved a dismissive hand at the moth-eaten bobcat, "are worthless. My advice? Take whatever personal effects you want and be gone by Monday. It will be less undignified." She left, her heels clicking a final, judgmental rhythm on the sidewalk. Arthur closed the door and slid his back down it until he was sitting on the floor. The clock wasn't just ticking. It was screaming. They had 3 days to prove a collection worth over $75 million was real before men with clipboards and price guns walked in and sold it all for scrap. They needed an expert, a discreet, trustworthy expert, and they needed one now. The expert's eye. Finding an art authenticator who was both reputable and discreet and would come to a crumbling museum in Ravenswood at a moment's notice seemed impossible. Arthur spent a desperate afternoon calling every name he found online, each conversation ending in polite refusal or outright skepticism. You have a lost Pollock in a museum? Sir, I think you've been watching too many movies. Ravenswood? Isn't that where the old Pellington place is? That white elephant? No, thank you. Hope was fading fast. It was Leo, leveraging the skills of his generation, who found a thread to pull. Deep in an online forum for art history students, he found an old post from a graduate student who had done their thesis on eccentric early 20th century American collectors. One chapter was devoted to Alastair Pellington. The student's advisor was a Dr. Eris Thorne, a semi-retired professor and independent authenticator known for his expertise in orphaned artworks. Pieces had fallen out of the public eye. More importantly, the forum post described him as a lovable curmudgeon who loved a good mystery. Arthur called the number listed for his private consultancy. A gruff voice answered on the fifth ring. Thorne. Dr. Thorne, my name is Arthur Pellington. I'm the grandnephew of Alastair Pellington. A pause. Alastair? Now there's a name I haven't heard in a dog's age. The man was either a visionary or a lunatic. My money was on lunatic. What do you want? Arthur took a deep breath and took the leap. I think I found his collection, the one he always talked about. The line was silent for so long Arthur thought the call had dropped. Dr. Thorne? Describe the Pollock, Thorne barked. Arthur, his hand shaking, held the phone to his ear and gestured frantically for Leo to bring up the photo. He described the colors, the chaotic energy, the size. He mentioned the signature. Another long silence. I'll be there first thing in the morning, Thorne said finally, his voice devoid of its earlier gruffness, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. Do not touch anything. Do not tell anyone I am coming. At 8 a.m. the next day, a battered, mud-splattered Subaru Outback pulled up outside. Dr. Eris Thorne was a man in his 70s, with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that missed nothing. He carried an old-fashioned doctor's bag filled not with medical tools, but with a high-powered magnifying loupe, ultraviolet and infrared lights, and a digital microscope. He barely greeted them, his eyes scanning the decaying main hall with professional disdain. Well, where is it? I didn't drive 4 hours to look at a stuffed weasel. They led him to the wall. Leo moved the display case and carefully peeled back the plastic sheeting. Thorne's eyes widened almost imperceptibly at the sight of the hidden entrance. He ducked through without a word. For the next 2 hours, Arthur and Leo watched from the opening as Thorne worked. He was a scientist, a detective, a priest at an altar. He moved from painting to painting with a reverent silence, using his tools to examine brushstrokes, pigment cracks, canvas weave, and signatures. He muttered to himself, taking tiny samples where it wouldn't be noticed, examining them under his microscope. He used the UV light to check for restorations and the IR light to see underdrawings. The tension in the room was suffocating. Arthur felt like he was waiting for a medical diagnosis. This man held their future in his hands. Finally, Thorne stopped in front of Pollock. He spent nearly 30 minutes on it alone. He finally stepped back, lowered his loupe, and let out a long, slow breath that seemed to have been held for a decade. He turned to Arthur and Leo, his face unreadable. He walked back through the hole into the main hall, wiping dust from his hands. Arthur's heart was in his throat. This was it, the verdict. Thorne looked at them, his sharp eyes moving from Arthur's terrified face to Leo's hopeful one. Well, Arthur finally croaked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Thorne's stern expression finally broke into a small, incredulous smile. Mr. Pellington, he said, his voice filled with a newfound warmth. Your great-uncle was not a lunatic. He was a goddamn genius. A secretive, obsessive, and apparently brilliant genius. He gestured back toward the hidden room. The O'Keefe is pristine. The Hopper sketchbook is a national treasure. The Wyeth exquisite. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And the Pollock is undoubtedly, unequivocally real. The Lost Convergence read. It's the find of a lifetime. Leo whooped, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed through the museum. Arthur felt the strength leave his legs. He sat down hard on the dusty bench beneath the whale, tears welling in his eyes. They weren't fakes. It was real. It was all real. But Thorne's smile faded, replaced by a look of grave seriousness. This changes everything, and it changes nothing. You still have a viper's nest of legal and financial problems. The bank, the taxes. If this becomes public knowledge before you're protected, you'll be eaten alive by vultures. The joy was instantly tempered by cold reality. The clock was still ticking. They had less than 48 hours. What do we do? Arthur asked, his voice raw with emotion. Thorne's eyes glinted. We don't call the bank. We call the Sotheby's Trust and Estates Division. I know the head of the department. We make a quiet, private deal for the entire collection and the property on your terms. And we do it today. The quiet deal. Dr. Thorne made the call from the museum's old rotary dial phone, its cord stretched taut into a quiet corner. He spoke in low, authoritative tones to someone named Elizabeth at Sotheby's. He didn't describe collection. He listed accession numbers, provenance codes, and lost art registry identifiers. He was speaking a language of power and legitimacy that Arthur could only dream of. He hung up and turned to them. Elizabeth Cho, head of trusts and estates. She's on a private plane. She'll be here by tonight with a preliminary team and a security detail. This stays between us until the paperwork is signed. The day passed in a surreal blur. Arthur and Leo, operating on a mix of adrenaline and disbelief, did the only thing they could. They cleaned. They didn't touch the hidden gallery, but they swept the main hall, straightened displays, and tried to make the place look less like a crack house and more like a respectable, if dilapidated, institution. It was a futile gesture, but it gave their nervous energy an outlet. Just as the sun was setting, another car arrived. This one was a discreet black SUV. Elizabeth Cho was a woman in her 50s with an air of unflappable calm and a razor-sharp mind. She was accompanied by 2 associates and 2 large men in suits who immediately began a quiet, professional perimeter check of the property. There were no gasps of astonishment when Thorne showed them the gallery. There were only quiet, professional murmurs. Remarkable. The condition is exceptional. Yes, that's the one from the Fisher catalog. They worked with gloved hands, taking their own photographs and notes. An hour later, they all sat around an old, stained table in what was once Alistair's office. Elizabeth Cho laid out a proposal. It was not an offer to buy the individual pieces. It was an offer for Sotheby's to act as the exclusive agent for the entire estate, the building and all its contents, both seen and unseen. We will immediately pay the outstanding back taxes and settle the bank debt to halt the seizure, she explained, her voice calm and reassuring. We will then handle all the legal intricacies, the authentication, the insurance, and the marketing. The collection will be sold over the course of a year in a series of dedicated auctions that will be a global event. Our fee is significant, she said, looking Arthur directly in the eye, but you will be left with a sum that will be life-changing, free, and clear. She slid a preliminary estimate across the table. The number at the bottom was net after all fees and taxes. It was a number so vast it was abstract. $52 million. Arthur looked at it, then at Leo, then at Dr. Thorne. His life had been measured in overdue notices and shrinking bank accounts for so long. This was a different universe. There's one condition, Arthur said, finding a voice he didn't know he had. The museum, the building, it was my uncle's dream. It can't just be torn down for a parking lot. A portion of the sale must be endowed to establish a real, functioning museum here, in his name. A small, curated one, featuring some of the local history pieces he loved. The Pellington Museum. Elizabeth Cho smiled, a genuine, respectful smile. That, she said, can absolutely be arranged. It's a fitting legacy. The papers were signed. Hands were shaken. The Sotheby's security team seamlessly took over, their presence a silent, powerful declaration that the fate of the Ravenswood Museum had irrevocably changed. The next morning, when the county assessors and the smug Miss Sterling from the bank arrived to begin the seizure, they were met not by a defeated Arthur Pellington, but by a poised Elizabeth Cho and a team of lawyers. Miss Sterling's face fell as Elizabeth calmly informed her that all debts had been satisfied in full and the property was no longer subject to seizure. The assessors packed up their clipboards and left confused. Arthur watched from the window as the bank's black sedan drove away, this time in defeat. He felt no triumph, only a profound, bone-deep relief. The weight was gone. The albatross had flown away, transformed into a phoenix. A legacy reforged. 1 year later, the grand reopening of the Pellington Museum of American Art was the event of the season in Ravenswood. The Victorian building had been restored to its original glory, its white paint gleaming, its windows sparkling. The whale skeleton, now properly conserved and wired, hung as a centerpiece in the bright, airy atrium. But the main attraction was a new Alastair wing, a state-of-the-art gallery that told the story of the reclusive collector and housed a permanent display of a dozen pieces from his legendary collection, the O'Keeffe, the Hopper sketches, the Wyeth. They were on loan from the various institutions and private collectors who had acquired them, a condition Arthur had insisted upon. The star of the show, the Pollock's Convergence Red, hung in a place of honor, its label noting it was on extended loan from the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The town, once pitying of the Pellington family's folly, now celebrated them. The museum had become a source of pride and a driver of tourism. Arthur, looking distinguished in a new suit that actually fit him, stood at the podium. He was no longer the weary, defeated man from a year ago. His shoulders were straight, his eyes clear. He spoke not of money but of dreams. "My great-uncle Alastair was called a fool," Arthur said, his voice carrying through the silent, packed hall. He saw value where others saw junk. He saw beauty where others saw decay. He believed in the power of a secret, of holding on to something beautiful, not for personal gain, but for the simple fact that it was beautiful. This museum is no longer a monument to his failure, but a testament to his vision, and it stands as a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for a curious eye and the courage to break down a wall. He looked into the crowd and found Leo, who gave him a proud nod. Leo was dressed sharply, a confident young man heading to Stanford in the fall, not because of the money, but because the experience had ignited a passion for art history and conservation. After the speeches, as guests milled about, admiring the art, a young couple approached Arthur. They looked nervous. "Mr. Pellington," the man said, We heard your story. It inspired us. We've been saving for years to open a small bookstore, but we were too scared to take the risk. We almost gave up." The woman nodded, her eyes shining. "But hearing you today about believing in a dream even when everyone thinks you're a fool, we signed a lease on the storefront this morning." Arthur felt a warm spread through his chest, far more valuable than any financial gain. His story, born from desperation and dust, had become a thing that inspired others. That was the real inheritance. Later that evening, as the last guest departed, Arthur and Leo stood alone in the main hall under the great whale. The silence was comfortable now, filled with peace instead of despair. "He'd be proud, you know," Leo said quietly, looking up at the bones of the giant creature. "Uncle Alastair, you didn't just sell his dream. You made it real." Arthur put an arm around his son's shoulders. "We did, Leo. I was too busy looking at the cracks in the walls to see the potential. You were the one who looked at the map. You were the one who heard the whisper in the wall." He smiled, looking around the beautiful, vibrant building that was once his greatest burden. "The treasure wasn't just the art, son. It was a reminder to never stop being curious, to never stop looking for the secret hidden behind the gray wall. That's the legacy worth everything." And for the first time in his life, Arthur Pellington felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be,